right, today's lecture is going to be about the notion of time, space, and perception and how that ties into spirituality. The notion of time is something that I think every single individual in this world has thought about, whether beating time or fast-forwarding time or going back in time. And there's something peculiar about time because even though we put so much value and so much weight on it, there really is no such thing as time. It's actually an illusion based on our perception, which comes from the mind. And really to understand what time is to understand what time is, we have to understand something about ourselves and particularly our consciousness. When we start doing this type of retrospection, or introspection rather, within ourselves, and we start seeing where does this time go, we can see that time is an illusion for many factors, because if we stop and think about when we were born, if we're 30 years old, if we're 40 years old, and we ask ourselves, well, where was time before we were born? We know that there was time. There's things that are here, they've had their evolutionary cycles, they've come, they've gone, other species have come and gone, and then we come on board, and then all of a sudden we start making up units of time, which are seconds, which are minutes, which are hours, years, and so on. Yet we know that from our perception, our time began when we were born, but we know that time had existed long before that. So when we go to sleep, for example, we know that there is a 5 or 8 or 10 hour period that lapses, which would be perceived to us as being a snap of a finger, essentially. And yet that there was many hours in that interval that seemed to have gone nowhere when we weren't consciously aware of our external environment. So it goes back to that fundamental question. In order to understand time, travel in time, do anything with time really, we have to understand what is it exactly that time is, first of all, in order to be able to do any type of manipulation if it's possible. And what's interesting is when we start studying certain types of scriptures, esoteric scriptures in particular, like me and my friend here were talking about a little bit earlier, you have certain scriptures that deal with time from the spiritual perspective, because science seems to have not been able to address a lot of those issues, even identifying what time is outside of having some type of linear measurement, saying that this is 1 second, fine. First of all, we know that's inaccurate because we know time is cyclical, not linear. But even beyond that, it's still the question of what is this business of time. And like I was saying earlier, that time seems to have some sort of answer or definition in scriptures, particularly in the sense that it identifies time as a state of consciousness, which is interesting. So I'll repeat that again, and I really want you to take that to heart as our tentative definition of what time is. Time is a state of consciousness. So what that basically means is that when we come into this world as human beings or physical beings, then we come in as, in a certain type of family, certain type of socioeconomic condition, we have certain karmas from our past, and what all of this does, from all the things that we've done in our past lives, we come into this world as human beings with a certain type of perception, a certain type of attitude about the world. And that attitude is the perception and the attitude that we have about the world has a type of motive force behind it, which is something we're not aware of exactly, and that something is consciousness. So basically, it's the way that consciousness translates through our mind, which gives us a perception and an attitude to our outside world, that when it observes things outside or that perceive to be outside, we start to believe that there's a certain type of thing called time. Because now we're seeing that you're looking at me, I'm looking at you, and there is a type of, what would be called a type of time or discrepancy between things I'm saying, things that I'm doing, because all of the consciousness within you is focused only through certain type of apparatuses, whether it's the ears right now, whether it's the eyes, whether it's the skin, the brain, the mind. And this consciousness, which is flowing only through a tunnel, only sees a small picture of it. And that small picture is what we are all experiencing right now in this room today. And we have memories of something happening yesterday and the day before, things we might want to do in the future. But nonetheless, the time is existing because of our mental perception of what's happening now. So basically, we know that that perception is not accurate for many reasons, because we know that what we see is not necessarily what things are. What we hear is not necessarily the full picture of what things really are. We know, for example, that there's a tremendous amount of electromagnetic radiation going through this room right now that we cannot perceive at all. But we know it because our cell phones work. If we turn on the radio, we can pick up thousands of radio stations. And even beyond that, if we had certain type of apparatuses that aren't even scientific, we would see that there are literally different beings, dimensions, and realities happening within this very room right now that we're not able to perceive because the limitations of our senses, which in total is called perception, isn't capable of registering anything outside of what we're going on right now. And that's really what time basically is it's a state of consciousness, what we said earlier. Basically, your consciousness is projecting through the perception apparatuses, and it's registering only certain type of phenomenon that's happening right now. Now, there's many different ways of understanding the bigger picture of basically time outside of that really you have to start wrapping your head around different characteristics of that phenomenon that I just described, which is consciousness or time as a state of consciousness. If we can, for example, when we hold on to grudges, or if we hold on to any type of a positive experience, what happens, if we think about it, is that our memory snaps back to something that either was really bad and it affects our whole being because we think about a negative event or a negative past occurrence, or a positive thing and we think about, oh, that was so great, I wish to experience it again. But what really happens is that the consciousness within us, that is actually the thing of essence, that's something that we have to understand through our spiritual practices, seems to go back to a point of a type of energetic frequency that was a perception before. And this is why we call it remembering. If you think about the etymology of that word, re means to do again, and member means to what? To member things together. It's an interesting word if you think about it, because our consciousness seems to travel into a certain energetic state, which we call a memory, based on our experiences. And when it does that, it replays it as if it was really happening, though we know it's long over. Whatever it was, whether it was good or bad, the event, the circumstance, the experience is over, but we can actually play it through our head as if it's really happening, even though we're not in that state anymore. Now that's an interesting thing, again, in relation to time, because you see, where did the time go at that moment? If you're so lost in that memory, then you're basically not only not in the present, but you're back at a certain place that time-wise no longer exists, yet your whole being can experience it. If you experience something extremely tragic, or something that was so great that you lose perception of everything around you, you just get lost in the moment and you're like, where are you? The consciousness is in a different time at that point. And so that is, by definition, a type of rudimentary time travel. It might not be what we are thinking of in terms of Star Trek or what we would want in the future, where we can literally transport our entire being, but an aspect of us has traveled in time, whether we project something in the future as a possibility that we want to experience, or something in the past that we're re-experiencing, whether it's a positive or negative event. Now, with that said, it's important to see that other aspect, that relation, because again, to understand the phenomenon, we have to do it through these types of characteristics and see how it all relates with these types of practical examples that we have. There's an interesting notion in the Yoga Sutras that I thought was kind of interesting in relation to time, that it talks about time, in conjunction with what we said, that time, in order to be prepared for a spiritual pursuit by way of meditation or concentration, then we have to let go of time. We have to let go of the past, basically. And I thought that was an interesting way of wording it because we hold on to time. Basically, when we grow up, we're believed to think we are a certain type of person with certain types of abilities and inabilities, and we have certain types of benefits about us, but then also certain types of liabilities about us. And this whole, as we progress, this conscious state that we see in the environment, we start to believe that we are certain types of people with certain types of limitations, which is basically, it's an aspect of time that's refracting back on us, and then we actually are our own worst enemies, you see? So when we want to become, I guess, for a lack of a better term, more spiritual people, in the sense that we start seeing the unity behind things, we have to let go of the things we thought we were that we really aren't. Because many times, even a positive idea about us is limiting, actually. And even if we can see that there's a unity between us by letting go of this time, letting go of the characteristics of what we thought we were in the past, letting go of the good and the bad experiences, and just seeing them as experiences as a matter of growth, rather than staying on with them then we can consciously grow and we actually start defeating time itself. Now, there might be a question that one would ask is, why would somebody want to defeat time? Why would somebody want to become timeless? And again, it comes back to the answer that our pursuit as individuals, whether we know it or not, is that we actually want to become God conscious again. And everybody does that through their own phase, or through their own path, through their own religion, through their own experiences. When we seek experiences, and we've all had this, we've wanted something really bad, either a boyfriend or an experience or a relationship or a job, and whatever it may be. And I'm sure all of you have experiences before that when you wanted it, you imagined it to be so much better than it was. And then at some point you may have acquired it, whatever it was, and then at some point after that, you look back and you said, well, that was not as amazing. I'm happy I did it, but it's not as great as I thought it would be. And it didn't make me a much better person as I thought it might, you know. And what's interesting about that is that what your consciousness did is it attracted an experience so that it can grow back into the bigger whole. So it can become slowly more timeless. And how it does that is through a series of experiences, it becomes timeless in the sense that your consciousness slowly starts not necessarily seeing time as necessary because you see a bigger whole. Your consciousness starts sublimating back into a bigger whole that is really the basis of all spiritual pursuits. And, I think this is another reason, this is kind of my postulation, is that I think this is a reason that as you get older, time seems to go a lot faster. Time doesn't necessarily go faster as such because, again, time doesn't exist, but the perception of it makes you believe it goes faster because your consciousness is not polarizing towards it as quick enough. When you're younger, you want to experience everything. You want to eat that candy. You want to go play that game. You want to go do this. You want to go do that. So you're doing all this. As you get older, you've had enough experiences to know that, maybe that isn't as great as it seems because after all, you've experienced much more. You have much more wisdom as you get older. Or that situation looks good on the face of it, but because you've had sour experiences, you know that there's no such thing as a quick buck or anything easy in this world. And so you're much more content with who you are, consciously speaking, as you get older, and therefore time is not so relevant, so it passes by much quicker because you don't polarize towards the time, per se. Now, on top of all that, it still goes back to, so what is exactly that time? And we said that time is a state of consciousness in space. We could even put that there, which is more or less the same thing that we already said, but it's just putting a little bit more characterization to it. Because we can just take a generic example. If you look at the universe as an oval or a circle, and we within it, and this is going to be a very simple example, we as human beings, let's say there's 100 of us in this circle, then our objective is for our consciousness to sublimate back into that whole. That is, scripturally speaking, what God consciousness is, and that's why it's a difficult thing for us to understand, or even for people who have realized that state, to be able to describe it, because it's beyond description, it's beyond words. It's a certain thing that if you experience, you know it, but you no longer see dichotomy, or you no longer have a perception about things, because our consciousness is not being isolated to specific points in space. So we can equally say that, yes, time is consciousness. It's basically a state of consciousness. But to add to that, we can also say that time is a state of consciousness which is isolated in a particular place, if that makes sense. And that's really what it ultimately comes down to, that space-time does not exist, and they're basically two sides of the same coin. Because when we polarize our consciousness to a specific event, then we see that's our world, that's our reality. If we're driving down the freeway, we see a horrible accident, all of your consciousness and energy goes to that. You forget everything. You forget about your bills, your family, just for a few seconds. You forget about everything because all of your consciousness is there in that, and you make that a reality. So the consciousness goes there. It has a certain state. That's a state of consciousness in a particular location. And then when you retract that, you keep driving, you retract it, and then after a while you forget it, it doesn't happen, it goes somewhere else. So the question is then, what do we do? And this is the question about scriptures, is the scriptures tell us to become immortal. We've probably all heard this in every single scriptures. The scriptures say, become immortal. God consciousness is immortality. It's beyond the timeless. You defeat death. So what does that exactly mean in terms of practice to do that? would be to retract that consciousness that seems to want to externalize itself into particular states of time and back to ourselves in order to realize that our consciousness, whether it's in our heart or when we retract it to a significant degree within our heart, we actually see the unity between all things, and we no longer see dichotomy or descriptions, basically dichotomy within environments. And we no longer see individual units, but we start seeing the bigger picture, which is not something that the senses can even perceive anyways. And so those are just some basic fundamental notions about space and time, and about basically how it ties into spirituality. Is that this is from my experiences when I was interested in that whole notion and I was trying to do certain types of meditations, then it always came to the question, well, what is time fundamentally? And I couldn't necessarily figure it out until I started going off into these types of characterizations, and then it made sense because we can see in our practical life that time is truly an illusion of the mind, and it's an illusion. Because again, where was time when you were born? Before you were born. There is no time. But yet we know that there was millions, billions, even for all practical intent and purposes, there was no such thing as time to us, but we know that things have existed. They've come and gone. Some of them, most of it is completely obliterated, never to be seen again or understood even by us. And then also, we're born, we're here right now. We know that there's a certain type of time going on. And then when we go to sleep, there's an 8-hour period that will go in the flick of a finger. And yet here we're going to sit in maybe 30 minutes, 1 hour, and it may seem long or short, but the point is that all of this is just a state of consciousness. And in reality, we are all connected underneath the perceptions of things. That the reason we're even here is because there's something fundamentally in us that sees that we're all fundamentally the same within us. And you just see me talking and I see you sitting there, but ultimately that's just a perception. It's not real, just like time. Because again, time is a state of consciousness within a particular physical location. So that was pretty much what I just wanted to discuss. Just a very general, brief overlay about space, time, which is, again, two sides of the same coin. Perception and how that ties into spirituality. And I know that you had some questions we were talking about outside before we started. So, because we started going on a lot of this and I didn't want to go too much into the discussion before.
So what we were talking about was, you had mentioned, or we were discussing time is death. And can you just kind of go into that a little bit
Right.
more?
So, again, in some of the scriptures we talk about, or they talk about rather, that time is death. When we talk about, for example, again, the Yoga Sutras, or we have the Rig Vedas, they have an avatar, or an anthropomorphized version of what death is, and it's called Yama. And Yama basically is the physical incarnation of death, and Yama will give you anything that you want, except for immortality, because they're basically saying that when your consciousness polarizes to a particular environment, and then you perceive things, even though we see that as basically a positive thing in our modern world, it's actually a death because your consciousness is being eradicated a little bit every single time. When you're experiencing this or experiencing that, that immortal aspect of you is always being stripped a little bit more away. And it's actually killing you, spiritually speaking, it's kind of killing you a little bit more because you become jaded, you become pessimistic, you become cynical. And what does that do in relation to sublimating back into the whole or becoming harmonious with everything? You see, it pulls you away farther, though we might think we're more wise or more intelligent, and in some regards we might be, but now as you get older, you see people as your enemy, or you don't trust people, and see these are all based off of previous experiences, where through these experiences, whether they're good or bad, the consciousness projects forward, and it takes a little bit of that godness of you, if you want to call it that, or that, it takes a little bit away through an experience, and then another experience comes, and like we were talking about the sine wave, then you have an experience, and then it goes away. Every experience ultimately ends. Even our own life ultimately ends. The human race ultimately ends. Even the earth ultimately ends. So it seems like for the physical world, death is the ruler of everything physical. And that's fine, as long as we understand that there's something behind it, which we have within ourselves, which is this unadulterated consciousness, that if we can retract to a certain degree and realize it, the self-realization of our own inner godness or inner consciousness, then we become immortal, and death kind of loses that battle for this lifetime and then every previous lifetime, because our consciousness sublimates back to the bigger whole, to the God consciousness that we talked about, and that's in relation to death, time being death. That's really what is meant, actually.
So when we're born, are we born into a consciousness, or are we born into time, or is it the same thing?
Well, no, the consciousness is not so much born. That's actually what is. That the individual consciousness that we have is what we can consider the soul, because God is consciousness ultimately, which is something that's difficult to understand, especially minus experience, because people will start putting, well, this is consciousness. Consciousness is this, and then, or it's like a trip that you have when you take certain drugs, which is not. It's the essence of what you are after the perception, after your mentality, after your biases, after even the forces. We can say, like, what makes your heart beat? Because nobody really knows. I mean, you have certain physiologies, but behind that, there's still even a reason why your heart beats. And this, you start coming very low into the fundamental ranges of why things even are, which is kind of the state of consciousness before it becomes bifurcated into different areas to perform different functions. And so the time is not real. It's not even here, really. Because again, if I was on different substances, I would have a totally different reaction to this whole environment, this whole scene. If I was asleep, I wouldn't even know it existed. If I was dead, I wouldn't even know it existed. So see, it's me as the individual perceiver that creates time as a matter of necessity, but the time doesn't really exist. Consciousness coming through or pouring through the perceptive receptacles, whether it's the eyes, the mind, the ears, the skin, whatever, that's what creates time, actually. It's the consciousness coming forth through the human element that creates the illusion or the apparition that time exists. But we know that time doesn't exist again, because outside of that perception, where is time? If you look at everything as a whole unit, they're saying that the whole universe is a circular, ovular unit, then where is time in that whole circle? There is none. There are just pinpoints of conscious things, well, infinite or trillions of galaxies and species being created, coming and going. But if you consider that whole universe as it is, universe, one verse, then there is no time, because it's all one unit anyways. There's just certain diversities and bifurcations happening of consciousness, which gives us the perception that there are many things happening and really nothing at all is happening. So that's kind of the thing, is what we really are in our essence, what everything really is just unperturbated, absolutely equilibrated consciousness. And that's really, I think, the end goal of every religion, is to reach back into that particular state within, through our human body. And then you become timeless or immortal, as they say. So, yeah, that's pretty much what that is.
So there is no time, and it's consciousness, and this dimension, they say, is the third dimension, right, that we're in?
Well, many dimensions. I mean, it depends what you're perceiving. I mean, we can say, because what they define as, I think that's a big debate, what dimensions are, because a mathematician is going to have a different definition of what dimension is to a New Ager, for example. You hear a lot about this 4D and 5D. I ask people, what does that exactly mean? Because I'm not sure even myself, even though I've heard it a million times. And they say that we're all going to ascend consciously. And I said, okay, well, minus using ambiguous terminology, what's the end result then? If you're saying we're going to all ascend, who's all, first of all, and where are we ascending to? And I guess what's the end goal? What's the picture of that? Dimension is basically a reality that serves a purpose. So like seeing would be a type of dimension, even really speaking. Hearing is a different type of dimension, because your eyes can't hear, nor can your ears see. And so every receptacle that you get, every receptacle of your body, which there are, they say 32 particular ways that the human body is influenced, and 33 ultimately. This is why 33 is a very significant number for either Masonry or through Jesus Christ. You have the 33 demons in Sufism. The Upanishads talk about 33. It's a number that's replete, and it's even in the Kabbalah, actually. You have the 32 paths, and then when it ascends up to Kether, then you become the 33rd, basically. What that means is that there are 33 ways, or 33 dimensions, how the human body is affected, basically. And these are what we can call dimensions. Now, that doesn't mean that that's all the dimensions that exist, because there are more than I think the human is capable of understanding or experiencing. That just means that there are 33 that affect the human phenomenon, if you want to call it that, what we call life as human beings. And it's about retracting those instead of the consciousness being able to pour out of that particular vessel, whether it's through the eyes or through feeling or tasting, even through intellectualizing or through rationalizing. Then it's a matter of stopping it, not by some type of crude discipline, but rather stopping it because you understand that that consciousness protruding forth is a type of death, so you're saving it to try to become immortal. Now, in terms of the dimensions, there are 32 specifically. I mean, we can go into that a little bit later. It's not so relevant right now, but that's basically in terms of like dimensions, because the consciousness is all that exists, and that is the end goal, as they say, for us to try to see when we retract our consciousness. Then what happens simultaneously is we start seeing the interconnectivity of all things. First, humans. This is what happens, I think, as people get older, because they become more sympathetic towards other people. And you see that happening. When you're a kid, it's just about you, nobody else. And then as you get older, maybe in your late 20s, early 30s, you're like, okay, it's about me and my family. And then as you get older, 50s, 60s, you're just like, okay, it's about me and my family and a community. And then maybe towards the end of your life, you see a lot of people become extremely philanthropic, and they want to help other people. They want a charity because they see not only is it towards the end of my life, but I think what happens is the consciousness, as a matter of experience, as it starts going back, and they see the interconnectivity between all human beings. And sometimes that extends out to animals. And in my particular opinion, and I've had experiences, that's why I say that, is that when you retract the consciousness even back further, not through the natural progression of living a human life, but if you try to expedite that process by way of meditation, then you actually can start seeing the interconnectivity between everything, human beings, even animals, even plant life. You have people that say they can hear or feel plants or rocks or water, and now they're showing that there are people that can literally speak to animals. I mean, they were showing that on National Geographic, and they can, people, they would test them like, what is my dog saying or something, and they would have such specific things that the animals would be saying, there's no way they could have made it up. So the point is that when you retract this consciousness through your, through the receptacles or the vehicles of our senses, which is really what the ego is, then you become more harmonious with everything around you. And that's really what it comes down to, is becoming more harmonious around you, and that's really what spirituality is. That's really what religion is, even at the end of the day. Look at the word religion. It's Latin for relego. Relego means what? It means to bind back. To bind back. What are you binding back? The consciousness. That's what you're doing, and that's why such things as like disciplines were instilled, celibacy was instilled. It's not so much that life is great, but we're gonna torture you, and I think that's what a lot of people take it as. It's a self-imposed discipline because you see the benefit of no longer externalizing your consciousness, but retracting it back, really to try to become God conscious, or to try to rediscover yourself, to try to know yourself. That's they're all saying the same thing, just a little bit different. So, yeah, that's what that would be. Yeah.
And so they say that a lot of scholars talk about how Saturn regulates time.
Yeah, so because Saturn never varies, that's why. Because Saturn is the only planet in our solar system that doesn't vary, and that's probably why they say that, because every other planet will variegate, whether it's Jupiter, Mercury, and I don't know, Pluto's not a planet they're saying now, but Uranus and Neptune, all the planets, because of their elliptical nature, they will actually vary in the duration in which they revolve around the sun, sometimes by seconds, sometimes by minutes, and sometimes by days. It depends what planet, what year we're talking about. Saturn is the only one that doesn't. So it basically is the timekeeper, as they say, because it does not variegate. It's always 29.5, whatever it is, years to revolve around the sun, and it never variegates at all. It's always dead on. What it was last year, what it was 100 years ago, is what it'll be 1,000 years from now. So I'm assuming that's probably why they chose Saturn as the timekeeper. What's interesting, I think, is how the hell did they know that? I mean, how the hell did they know that 500 years ago, or 1,000, or even in some cases, like you have Vedic astrology, which goes back 5,000, 10,000 years. How the hell did they know that? Because, I mean, to be able to say that planet that's 50 million miles away is off by, 5 seconds, but that one over there seems to never be off, and we've been mapping it for 1,000 years. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how they know that, but they know it somehow. But that's why Saturn is considered the timekeeper, is because it never variegates in its orbit, ever.
But if there's no time, then what is it keeping?
Well, I think it's the timekeeper in terms of maintaining law, which it goes back to, maintaining order in the physical cosmos. I think that's what it is in terms of its accuracy, because the fact that every planet variegates shows that it has a sense of volatility, right? And like you were saying, being a stockbroker, nobody likes volatility because volatility means a bad thing. Sometimes people can gain, but most of the time people get screwed in volatility because volatility is chaos. And because in an ideal world, we want to keep everything according to some type of law, something that is consistent every single time, then what planet could be a representation of that? And Saturn is a great representation because that one, celestially, astrologically, represents accuracy in the sense that it does what it does every single time, like the law should. If I say something, hopefully it'll have meaning, because if it doesn't, then you're wasting everyone's time. But if it does have meaning, then that's something that you want to look up to because it's relational to the accuracy or harmony of the universe, which Saturn seems to be. And that's why it's not only the timekeeper, but remember, time is an aspect, it's an illusion, but it's an illusionary aspect of the physical universe, of everything physical. If you can surpass space-time or the time concept, that would indicate consciously you're no longer in this universe, even though physically you might be. But we hear, of gurus and saints and sages, that become timeless or immortal, that yes, their physical bodies are still here, but where's their consciousness? That's the question. Where is their consciousness? And if they live the types of things that they're preaching, then they're in a different reality, a different realm. They are either on the borderlands, really speaking, or they are actually in tune with God or the oneness of the universe. But after you exit that realm, or the Garden of Eden, and you come out of those gates, then there's another order that has jurisdiction over everything, which is death or time. Time has jurisdiction over everything for us now, even though it's an illusionary. But because our consciousness gives it a reality, because we polarize towards it so much, then it becomes real for the time being, even though we know it isn't not real. Because what happened yesterday? Where was yesterday? You did something. You spent some time. You spent some energy. You gave it emotion. You gave it positive thoughts and negative thoughts, and it's related to today. Yet it's not there. And what happens when you forget it? What happens in 20 years when yesterday you totally forgot yesterday? Did it ever even happen? You see? So that's what I really mean, that it's a state of consciousness, even though that's an oversimplification. It's actually the truth of the matter, but it's a difficult thing to understand because I guess the trick is to understand what your consciousness is first. We would say, well, my body is consciousness, or my heart is consciousness, or when I feel love, that's consciousness. No, that's an aspect of consciousness. But what is consciousness unadulterated before it goes through the channels of perception? Before it goes through those channels of perception, that's what consciousness is. You see, and it's something. It's more really of an unadulterated energy. But I don't even want to use energy because energy could be, heat, pressure, electromagnetism. But still, it's something more fundamental than that, like what we were talking about outside. So, that's why they use time or Saturn to indicate time, because death is ultimately who rules this world, the physical world. Death is what rules that. Because no matter what happens, whether it's a gnat, whether it's our body, whether it's the United States or the solar system itself, who will have the ultimate say when it exasperates its energy? Death will. There are things beyond death. I'm not saying that that's the ultimate reality, but for the physical, what we would call the physical, tangible reality, death seems to be the moderator of everything. And that's why they gave Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper, remember, with the sickle and the black robe, or the judges, that keep the laws in order, is because the idea is that what is the thing that keeps the most order in the physical world? And to our solar system, not necessarily in the Milky Way or the cosmos themselves, but in our solar system, Saturn, because of its lack of variegation, really its complete accuracy of revolving around the sun so many times, seems to be a good representation, an energetic celestial representation of rigidity. What's going to work today? What we want, something that we know will work every day because we can plan our lives around that. If we go outside and there's always war and chaos going on, we can't do anything. We can't build a society. You can't raise a family or build a crop or go build buildings if there's wars going on outside. I mean, look at the Middle East, like we were talking about ISIS. You can't do that because maybe you'll build a beautiful building and then all of a sudden one day it'll be blown up. So what's the point of doing anything in a volatile environment? You see, it's kind of that type of mentality, that type of philosophy. And because consistency is what's called for in order for us to progress as a human race, then you want to see something that works every single time, and Saturn seems to be that. So that's why,
Very good.
Yeah. And we're also talking about, I know, sinusoidal waves about that, but that's kind of the same thing. But what were you gonna say?
I want to say, did you see the movie Lucy?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. I want to know what you thought about at the end. You know, there was that whole thing when she finally, you know, got to her 100%
Right.
of using her brain. She,
Exactly.
in essence, didn't exist anymore. She just
She
disappeared.
became timeless.
Not necessarily
Because she sublimated. You notice what was happening as she was going in 99%. She was starting to go towards everything
Yeah.
to a black thing, and then she disappeared. Because what I think the writers were saying is that individuality sublimated into everything, which is exactly what I was saying. But go ahead and finish.
No, that's what I was saying. Like, what did you think? Was that a good example of what it was saying? And the way she could shift through time, like you're on an iPad just shifting through pages,
Right.
or pictures.
Right.
You know, she could just
Because she displaced her consciousness. I
Yeah.
think that's what the screenwriters and really the producers of that movie were saying, was what we already kind of touched upon, that time is a state of consciousness. If you can, you know, if you go to a room where you can be alone and you start thinking about something horrible that happened to you 20 years ago, you can get so lost in that memory that you're not aware of your physical body at all. You know, somebody could be yelling at you, hey, 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 and you're not there until they hit you so hard that you snap out of it. But see, that's the whole point, is that where is your consciousness? That's where time is. You know, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but where the majority of your consciousness, I want to use the term polarizes, that's where time is, because you've created time by moving that consciousness somewhere. And it's like Lucy was the same thing.
Yeah.
It's because she wanted to go back in time, so her mind, which is an aspect, a more subtle aspect of consciousness, goes to a different place. And she manifested there. And you notice towards the end when she started going up to the 90s, you know, 80, 90, 99%, what was happening is her physical body was dissolving. Like we say, the sages, you know, they say they're no longer even, you can hit them, you can shoot them, and maybe they'll die, but they're not really aware of what's going on because they're no longer polarized to this physical limitation or the physical individuality. Their consciousness is somewhere else. And that's the key to understand, because that's really what makes time, is the consciousness. Where's the consciousness when the consciousness comes out in a certain vehicle? Like right now, all your guys' consciousness is here. So this is what's real right now. Yet there's something going on outside, and we all know that, but you're not aware of it until I just told you, because this is what's real right now, only because the consciousness made it real. But if you were all asleep, where's your consciousness? Somewhere else. Maybe it's in a bad dream. Maybe it's not. It's in deep sleep. You're not even aware of anything. Maybe you're having a great dream. But the point is that it is consciousness, when projected through the vehicles of our bodily faculties, whether it's the eyes, the mind, perception, memory, that creates time. And when it goes to that faculty, and then it's in a particular space, remember, space-time is basically two aspects of the same coin. Go ahead.
This sublimation back into everything kind of is, that might be like, I am that, I am.
It's exactly it. I am that, right. Is exactly, because, and it's even in the Bhagavad Gita, that's one of the last verses, is that Krishna basically says, I remember. And that's what he's referring to. When you're going through these stages, or the plight of life, because life, that whole story is about life being a struggle, a battle from day one. And you see certain types of things that you like and certain types of things you don't like. And some things you want to embrace, and some you're like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. It's too big of a problem. I don't have the strength or the energy, the resources, the time to deal with that. And as you're going through this fight of life, and which the fight of life is experiences, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, then that consciousness starts sublimating particular types of events. And then as it does, then ultimately, after you've had enough experiences, you realize it's all illusionary. You see, because even all the things that you'd had once, or the first jobs that you had, the first situations that as you're growing up, you remember when you were in your teens and you had your first job, or your first girlfriend, or your first car, it was such a big deal. Now you go down and you buy a car, you don't even think about it. Because you've already, you see it, your consciousness, there's an intelligence that understands it for something more general than, wow, it's the car. You see it just as a practical vehicle, and even outside of that, you don't really think about it, maybe outside of practical reasons. But the point is that through these experiences, the consciousness almost automatically will start retracting itself, and this is kind of what we call wisdom. And through, I guess, enough lifetimes, if you don't particularly pursue that in this world, in meaning meditation or spirituality, then ultimately you come to the conclusion that I am that, or you are that, or I remember, which is more or less the same way of saying you are that. In those types of scriptures, that's what they say, is you're not looking at a chair saying there's a chair and I'm here, or you're there and I'm here. You see, the fact that we could even understand each other shows that there's an inherent similarity between us. The fact that you can perceive a wall or a chair or a dog or an animal or a rock, there has to be something fundamentally similar inside of you already to that in order to be able to perceive that. You can't make a connection to something that's disconnected. It's not possible. And there is. Not necessarily the fact that, that there's a rock that's granite, and then, because there's no part of granite in me, but outside of that molecular composition, there's something similar, and that's that consciousness that when you start to understand yourself, when you start to get to know thyself, as they say, you start saying, oh my God, that it really is just one thing. There aren't many things. And it's a high state. I'm not saying, we're talking about it here very casually as if it's something that we can go do after this lecture, but it's something, that's a little bit more complicated, and I think it requires a lot of self-sacrifice, personal sacrifice, in the context that, you see things and you're like, okay, I see this doesn't have value because it does this. And so you retract that, and then you have another perception. This could take years or lifetimes, again, until you reach that particular state where you can, officially say, you are that, But yeah, it's the same thing, exactly, it's the same thing. And time is really the last moderator before that. Because right before you reach, as they say, that state of God consciousness, there's one last thing that's holding you, and that's death. Are you afraid of physical death? Because if you are, you can't pass it. But if you're ready to sacrifice that body and move on, and you release that space-time dynamic or characteristic, which is actually, if you're familiar with the chakra system, the Akasha is space-time. So if you can get rid of all of these and you go up to the third eye, or the Ajna chakra, then you become immortal, essentially. And that's actually even the Egyptians. You remember the Egyptians? This is another topic altogether, but they had the serpent coming out of the third eye, which represents the serpent is down here, and it's actually the force that comes up through here, and that means that you've ascended all the realities of Earth, and now you've become kind of a coiled serpent on itself, where you see the energy within you has become attuned with the oneness of things, which is where the Eye of Providence comes from. It's not a symbol of Illuminati, as people think. I mean, maybe they adopted it, but the Eye of Providence. Again, these symbols go back thousands of years to what is today called Iraq, and they found even pyramids that are 13,000 years old in Bolivia with the Eye of the Providence on there. So, and then of course the Eye of Horus, which is kind of a symbolic representation of that. But it ultimately goes back to consciously realizing the unity of all things. That's really what it is. Yeah. Anything else?
I have one more question then, or one more statement of what you think of it. Do you think then, if your consciousness is based on time, that you're limiting yourself, or limiting the consciousness?
Absolutely, because that's all perception is. It's a limitation.
Yeah.
And that's why when we limit ourselves too much, and we see that, you can see that in a practical experience, that when we're in a hateful environment, or when we're anxiety-ridden, or when we are basically any kind of thing that it's considered a negative thing, it's really an isolation of that consciousness to something that isn't the truth. And that's why we feel very frustrated, or very agitated, very uneasy about ourselves. And the more we are able to expand that consciousness, then we get more feelings of harmony, or what we call love, basically. So any type of perception is ultimately limited by the virtue that perceptions aren't real. You're perceiving me with your eyes, you're hearing me with your ears, but what's really the nature of everything is that you're limiting yourself only to those faculties. Your consciousness is only traveling through those faculties, and you're receiving from me only what you can hear, see, maybe smell from me, maybe touch me. That's it. But we know there's so much more to the picture, and outside of that, what else is happening around the world? You're not aware of what's going on with your children, or at your bank, or in other realities, because there's so many things going on that when you're limiting the perception, or rather limiting your consciousness through the way of the perceptions of the physical body, then basically it is nothing but a limitation, because human perceptions are a limitation. Sure, some people will argue that our intellect is more intelligent than animals. That's a subjective argument. I don't believe it, but some people will argue that. But nonetheless, it's not whole in the sense that you are consciously a part of something bigger. You're just consciously part of what's going on here through a limited number of faculties. So by its very nature, it's extremely limiting, though we might perceive it as not, but it is. We just never experienced anything else beyond it, so you don't know. It's like people have never experienced love. They think that the world is nothing but a hateful place where you got to kill or be killed. But, because they've never experienced anything beyond it. Once you've experienced things beyond it, and I think that's the key, is to consciously experience something that is more general than what the senses can provide, then you start seeing, oh wow, that was a very limited state that I had. But, before that, it's just theoretical, of course. So, yeah.
Is it trapped in time via experience, so that's where they lose the timelessness because they're.
That is it, exactly. Because, you know, I'll try to describe it, but it's a difficult thing, again, to understand. If you look at it like the whole universe is a whole, we'll just say, well, it's an oval. And there's no necessarily anything outside it or in it, but what happens is that our consciousness, which the whole universe is just a ball of consciousness, then our consciousness, our individual being, somehow it ripped away from that or pulled away from that. Somehow it fell off of that. If some of you are familiar with the story of the prodigal son in the Bible, that's exactly what the whole story talks about, basically, is that, you know, you tell God, go screw yourself, I'm better than you because I'm an individual. So you assert your individuality, which is the ego. That's what it is. And we all have ego. The fact that we're in a human state is an ego state. It's not necessarily a negative thing. You know, you can be a positive ego person, but being aware of the physical body is ego. That's what it is. Latin is what? It's ego is a Latin term for I. And philosophically, it goes back to the idea that you are aware of your individuality. And that's not a good thing. Even if you're a good person or a charitable person, spiritually speaking, you are devoid of the whole harmony of things. And so, if you imagine that ball again that I was talking about of consciousness, there's something that happens that a drop of consciousness, or it pulls away from it somehow and asserts its own individuality, which is what the physical world is. It's not just us, it's everything. It's everything from animals to butterflies to rocks to planets. That actually asserts its own individuality, its own unique independence, even though it isn't. Like, we're not independent. We all think we're independent, but your whole body depends on air that you don't understand, a heartbeat that you don't understand, an economic system that none of us understand, a political system that none of us understand. You see, there's no such thing as independence, and that's the illusion of it, because we always have been part of a bigger whole that we don't understand. And that illusion that you're an individual being is really the whole plight of the human phenomenon, because you think you're an individual person when you're not, you know. And it's like they say, you don't know what you have until it's gone. Well, when things start getting stripped from you, you're like, oh wow, I really depended on that, yet you took it for granted. Same thing. Now, as you go through, this is what they call the cosmic evolution, when you get pulled away from the whole, or when you decide to assert your independence consciously, pulling away from the whole, or God, as the prodigal son states, then you go through what they say, an evolutionary cycle, a spiritual or conscious evolutionary cycle. And what that is for everybody is completely different. I mean, you could have come off as something etherical that none of us understand, or perhaps a rock, a tree, maybe you came straight into the human form. And this is where we find basically the evolution of consciousness. And you take a type of form that is conducive for you to experience certain things in what now you're perceiving as the world. Does that make sense? And the more experiences that you have, it kind of goes back to that you had this experience and you're like, oh wow, I see that that's not the truth. I perceived and I thought it was the truth, but when I experienced it, I saw it to be something different than what I thought it would be. And as you have many experiences like this, again, throughout your life, and then maybe 5 lives or 1,000 lives, you know, as every scripture says, well, I guess even the Bible kind of does, then you're basically evolving spiritually. And it's difficult to understand unless you become subtle, because you understand this more as a mental thing. You know, like, oh, when I was younger, I was so unwise. And now that I'm a little bit older, I see the errors of that, even though I thought it was good, or the errors of that, even though I thought it was good. And then it takes so many lifetimes until you are able to understand that your consciousness is actually part of a bigger whole. And so the individual being, what we are right now, what we do to assert ourselves, is actually, if we want to call it that, there's no such thing as good and bad. But if we want to put labels on it, then evil is actually isolated independence asserting itself from a bigger whole. That's really what evil is. It's basically you have a whole, and when something says, no, this is me and you're all against me, or I'm my own individuality, it creates a disturbance in the equilibrium. And that disturbance in the equilibrium, spiritually speaking, is what evil actually is, which I think is kind of interesting, because right now, as we're coming towards the end times, biblically speaking, not that I'm a huge biblical scholar, but I think it's interesting that they're saying we're in the end times, everything is evil, and what it's an assertion today is more of an assertion of the individual ego than ever before, with iPhones and personal computers, and everything's about me, right? Everything's about me, look at me, you know, people are striving for something they'll never get. But I think it's kind of, it's an interesting observation to see that that basically that is what the problem is, spiritually speaking, is that there's an assertion of independence, an assertion of individuality in the being. It could be a human being like we are, it can be an animal, it could be a plant, it could be a rock. But the point is that once it thinks it's not part of a bigger whole, it's lost its essence because it's always part of a bigger whole. There's no such thing as individuality. And that's really what the space-time perception is, and that's why it's an illusion. Is because we think we're individual, but we're not individual. Again, what makes your heart beat, even if you think about it? What makes your mind work? And you and I had a discussion about that you try to go into a meditative state once, and you were observing your mind going crazy thinking about all these things. But stop. Who's observing that exactly, if you're your mind? You see? Who's observing that mind going crazy? If there's something silent, which you're still saying is part of you, but yet now you've become aware that there's a totally different layer of you that's going crazy. But who's observing that craziness? You see? And then if you go further back, there's still even that silent observer, there's still something behind it. And this is what we would call the unadulterated consciousness, that if you can get to that place, which is complete equilibrium, then you've reached God's consciousness because you start seeing the interconnectivity of things. And it's not an easy thing. Again, we have an hour or two here to discuss these concepts, just to throw them out there very vaguely. But these are some notions of space and time. And one more thing I wanted to add to that, and that we were discussing yesterday, was the notion of relative time. Because we as human beings, we've all probably seen this after a rainfall, for example, and we've seen moths come out of the ground, or flies or gnats come out of the ground, and literally the day they're born, they die. I've seen it. I think a lot of people here have seen that. And you think to yourself, if you're in that mood, you think, what the hell was the point of that existence? You were born, and 2 hours later you died. And from our perception, because we have 50 years or 80 years, 100 years on this earth, that we would say, what's the point of that? And it's really a cosmic evolution that for that particular isolated consciousness, it served a purpose. Just like if we were to say, if just go with me for a minute here, and I'll actually explain why this is probably real, but if we get we know a tree is alive, for example. We know, there's these trees in Joshua, and then there's the other tree in somewhere in Israel that's something like 15 or 2,000 years old. And then we know this is a live being. It's an individual live being. And you think from its perspective, if it could perceive by way that we do, we know trees do perceive. The secret life of plants is justified, shown that the plants are alive. But if plants observed and perceived things the way we did, or trees in this particular case, and it saw us go through our cycles, which to it is meager, why were you born for 50 years to die? Yet it's so important to us. Then we see how we can see that our perception isn't necessarily accurate in terms of us being superior or anything, or even our lives meaning necessarily what we think it means. And if we take that a little bit further, we can say, well, what if rocks could perceive? Rocks are boulders that have been here for 100,000 years or 500,000 years. And, because if you fast forward, if you can do like Lucy did and do this like on an iPad, and you can just fast forward through, 100,000 years, you would see that rock actually, it gets created just like people do. It has a certain lifespan, it degenerates, and then it ultimately crumbles and degenerates back into something more whole, just like the human being. Just like plant life, just like anything that has an individual assertion or asserting itself as an individual being. You see, so when we look at time like that it's really just a perception that we're giving, and it's not really real. It serves a purpose for the physical, like we said, and who controls time is death. Because ultimately, death will get the final say. Whether you are a rock that lives 100 years or a sun that gets 5 billion years or 12 billion years, as our astrologers or astronomers are alleging that our solar system has, then it doesn't matter, because what does time really mean at the end of the day? If death wins, you just have a certain amount of perceptions or experiences to go through as an asserted individual. However, again, that individuality is asserted, or is rather rooted, I should say, in something more fundamental, which is the consciousness, which is our individual consciousness. And that is the thing that we have to realize by way of our experiences, or by way of retraction or concentration, or by our chosen path, to understand basically the God consciousness within us.